You're no longer family. Those were the words that cut through my heart like a jagged blade, and I can still feel them now if I close my eyes and imagine standing outside the church dressed in black, my hands trembling as I clutched the same rosary my mother once gave me, being told in that moment that I no longer belonged. But before I take you any further, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Ruth Ann, and I want to thank you for sitting with me today. And before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I would truly love to know. And now let me take you back to the day I lost both my son and the last shred of dignity his wife tried to strip from me, because the morning of the funeral was bitter cold, not just in the weather but in the people who should have been standing beside me in grief. My only son Matthew was gone, my pride and my joy, the child I raised on my own after his father passed far too early, the boy I gave everything to even when I had nothing. And on that dreadful morning all I wanted was one thing: to say goodbye. But when I arrived at the church, I could already feel the unease in the air, the whispers, the heads turning in my direction, and still I pressed forward, telling myself I belonged there because of course I did. I was Matthew's mother, and that was when she stopped me. My daughter-in-law Clarissa standing at the doorway, a woman who once smiled sweetly at me when she wanted something but whose true nature had been revealed long before that day, blocking the entrance with her arms crossed and a stony face, her black veil pulled back just enough for me to see the cold satisfaction in her eyes as she hissed, "You shouldn't be here," her lips curling into a smirk while my throat went dry and I said, "Clarissa, I am his mother," only for her to lean closer, her perfume sharp and suffocating, and whisper, "Not anymore. You're no longer family," before slamming the heavy church door shut right in my face with deliberate cruelty, leaving me frozen there as the muffled sound of the choir leaked through the stained glass windows, and I could almost hear the priest speaking about Matthew's soul, his kindness, his life, while I stood barred from mourning the child I brought into this world, my knees buckling as I gripped the railing to steady myself under the unbearable humiliation. While people glanced at me with pity or quickly looked away to avoid the shame Clarissa had cast on me, and I wanted to scream, to pound on the door until someone let me in. But grief has a strange way of stealing your strength, so I simply stood there with tears streaming down my face, whispering prayers into the cold morning air, thinking back to when Matthew first introduced Clarissa to me, and how I had reservations even then because she was polished and elegant, the kind of woman who could charm a room. Yet behind that charm, I sensed a hunger not for love but for control, and still I bit my tongue and told myself that if she made my son happy, I would learn to accept her. But over the years, I watched as she pulled him further and further away from me, phone calls growing shorter, visits becoming less frequent, and when I did see him there was a tiredness in his eyes I couldn't place, and Clarissa, she always found subtle ways to remind me she was the new center of his life. And now there I was, standing in the cold, barred from the one place I had every right to be. And as the funeral ended and people spilled out of the church, some avoided my gaze entirely, while others whispered awkward condolences, torn between loyalty to me and fear of Clarissa. And I saw her laughing softly with friends as though the entire day were a performance staged for her benefit, her laughter growing louder when she noticed me still standing there as she slipped her arm through another man's and paraded down the steps with cruel confidence. The message cleared that she believed she had won. Yet deep inside me, though I was trembling, a small ember of resolve began to glow, because I didn't know it then, but that humiliation outside the church was only the beginning of a battle. As Clarissa believed, she had stripped me of everything and erased me from my own son's life story, never realizing that Matthew, my boy, had left behind something far stronger than her cruelty, something that would one day bring her arrogance crashing down in front of everyone, and I would live to see it. Though in the days that followed, the funeral stretched on like an endless winter, and my house felt quieter than ever, every corner echoing with Matthew's childhood, the sound of him running down the hallway in mismatched socks, practicing his guitar late into the night, the faint scent of his cologne from the last time he hugged me, ghosts pressing in on me from every side. And yet what cut deeper than the silence itself was the humiliation that refused to fade. Word travels fast in our little town, and by the very next day I knew people were whispering, some calling to check in with voices that carried hesitation as though they didn't want to get caught choosing sides, while others avoided me entirely. And the worst part was that I could hear the pity in their tone, a sound worse than anger, because it reminded me that Clarissa's cruelty had become a public spectacle. And still, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in front of the church, the way she said, "You're no longer family," knowing now that it wasn't grief that fueled her, but victory. And that realization told me something important. Clarissa wasn't mourning. She was calculating, and a week later I went to the cemetery alone, the air sharp, the ground still damp with morning dew, Matthew's grave fresh with flowers piled high from the service. As I knelt beside it and ran my fingers across the cold stone, whispering, "Oh my boy, why did you choose her? Did you know what she would do to me? Did you know she'd turn me away?" My tears falling into the soil, as for a moment I thought I heard his voice, not in words, but in memory, remembering how he once told me, "Mom, no matter what happens, you'll always be my home." And I clung to that memory like a lifeline. But grief is never left alone for long, because, as I stood brushing dirt from my skirt, I saw Clarissa in the distance, walking with a couple of her friends, dressed in a sleek coat, not in morning black, but in something far too fashionable for such a somber place, laughing and pointing as though the cemetery were just another place to show off. And I ducked behind a row of hedges, not out of fear but exhaustion, because I didn't have the strength to face her again. Yet, I overheard enough to make my stomach twist, as Clarissa said sharply and with certainty, "She'll get nothing. Matthew's will is airtight. The money, the estate, it's all mine now. She'll be left with her little shack and her memories. That's what she deserves." Her friends, chuckling, as Clarissa's laugh rang out like broken glass, while I pressed a hand to my chest, thinking of money and estate and how Matthew had worked hard and built something substantial, with a house, investments, maybe even the old family property, none of which I had ever cared about because all I wanted was to be part of his life. Yet the cruelty of her words burned, because she didn't just want Matthew's things, she wanted to erase me completely and leave me with nothing, not even dignity. And that night I couldn't sleep as I sat by the window rocking in my chair and staring at the stars, my mind circling one thought over and over: what had Matthew really written in his will? Because Clarissa was so confident and smug that I wondered if she had pressured him, twisted his hand, even though my son wasn't foolish, knowing that love can blind even the wisest of men. And 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in my mailbox from Matthew's lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, a fair man I had known for years who had always treated me with respect. The formal invitation to the reading of the will making my heart thud as I read it, part of me not wanting to go out of fear that Clarissa was right and Matthew had left me nothing, the thought of sitting in that office watching her gloat, making my stomach churn. But another stronger part of me, knowing I had to be there, not for money or property, but for the truth, because I needed to hear my son's final words and know whether he had truly forgotten me, or if somewhere beneath Clarissa's influence his love for me still lived. And when the day of the will reading arrived, I dressed carefully, not in morning black, but in a deep navy dress Matthew had once complimented me on when he said, "You look elegant, Mom," words I carried with me like armor as I walked into the lawyer's office to find Clarissa already there, sitting with perfect posture and that familiar smug smile, her friends absent because she didn't need them, with the confidence of a queen awaiting her coronation, as she said with mock sympathy, "Well, look who decided to show up. Don't worry. This won't take long. You'll be on your way soon enough." And I took a deep breath and met her gaze, feeling for the first time since the funeral not small but ready, prepared to hear whatever truth awaited me as Mr. Whitaker entered the room with a stack of papers, his eyes softening when he saw me, and giving a small nod before asking, "Shall we begin?" And just like that, the room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation, the ticking clock growing louder as every second stretched, while Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and opened the thick folder on the polished oak table, reflecting the tension of Clarissa sitting tall and smug and me sitting quiet but steady with my hands clasped together to stop their trembling, as he began. "First of all, I want to extend my condolences once more. Matthew was a good man, and he will be missed," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice calm and professional. Yet those words tightened my throat as for a brief moment I saw Matthew again, as a little boy running into the house after school, his hair sticking out in every direction, and his smile bright enough to chase away even the darkest day, before Clarissa cleared her throat impatiently and cut in, "Yes, yes, thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Can we proceed?" Her tone icy, and her lips twitching, as though she already knew exactly what was written in those papers. And Mr. Whitaker shot her a glance before continuing that the will began with smaller personal effects, explaining that Matthew had left his watch collection to his cousin Henry, prompting Clarissa to roll her eyes dramatically and scoff, a watch collection. Please, let's not waste time with the trinkets. Though to me they weren't trinkets at all, because each bequest felt like a piece of Matthew's heart being placed carefully into the hands of those who had mattered to him. His old guitar going to a lifelong friend, his books to a local library, his savings bonds divided among a couple of charities he supported, every detail painting the picture of a man who thought of others even in death. And I sat quietly absorbing every word, while Clarissa shifted in her chair like a cat waiting to pounce, her impatience boiling as her smirk grew wider with every page the lawyer turned, until finally Mr. Whittaker reached the section everyone had been waiting for, and cleared his throat with the faintest pause before saying, "And as for the remainder of the estate," causing Clarissa to straighten and smooth her skirt as she muttered under her breath, "finally," while he continued, "including property, financial accounts, and any assets not otherwise specified," her eyes gleaming as he finished. "Matthew leaves them in full to his wife." Clarissa, and her smile broke into a victorious laugh as she tilted her head toward me, eyes sparkling with malice, and said mockingly, "Well, well, Ruth Ann, I told you you'll leave here with nothing." Words that echoed in my head just as they had at the funeral, though this time they stung less, because I noticed something she did not, that the lawyer wasn't closing the file, and his finger lingered on the page as his eyes scanned further, while Clarissa leaned back, crossing her legs in satisfaction, and letting her laughter fill the room, as she added, "I'll be sure to take good care of the estate. Not that it concerns you any more." And I remained silent, my heart aching. Yet something about Mr. Whittaker's expression made me pause because he wasn't finished, though Clarissa, oblivious, reached for her purse as if ready to leave triumphantly, and even had the nerve to pat my hand with mock sympathy as she smiled wide and said, "Don't take it too hard. Maybe the church needs volunteers. You could find some purpose there." But before she could rise, Mr. Whittaker spoke again, his voice firm now. "Actually, there is one final clause." The words dropping into the room like a stone into still water, as Clarissa froze mid-laugh and turned slowly with her smile faltering to ask, "What do you mean?" while Mr. Whittaker adjusted his glasses and flipped to the final page, explaining that Matthew had included a specific provision that superseded the general distribution of assets, and that it was his express wish this clause be read aloud in the presence of both of us. My breath catching and my heart pounding as Clarissa blinked rapidly, her confidence flickering for the first time since we entered the room as she stammered, that can't be right, I was told," before stopping herself, cheeks flushing. And Mr. Whittaker ignored her and began to read steadily, "In the event of my passing, I leave the family mansion located on Ridgewood Hill," to pausing as he looked between us while Clarissa's knuckles whitened, gripping her chair, and my pulse thundered in my ears, "to my mother, Ruth Ann," and the room fell into pure, deafening silence as for a heartbeat I thought I had misheard him, and Clarissa's jaw dropped, her mouth opening and closing, like a fish gasping for air, as the color drained from her face, and the smug smile she wore dissolved into nothing, while I sat frozen staring at the lawyer with trembling hands as the weight of his words sank in, because I hadn't expected it and hadn't even dared to hope. Yet Matthew, my boy, had left me the very thing Clarissa thought she had secured for herself. And in that instant everything began to shift, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like church bells tolling over the valley, "to my mother, Ruth Ann," and the silence that followed was almost unbearable as Clarissa's face twisted, disbelief etched into every sharp angle, her painted lips trembling as if trying to form words she herself couldn't fully understand, before she sputtered that it had to be a mistake and slammed her hand against the table, insisting the mansion was hers and that he had promised her everything, while Mr. Whittaker calmly lifted his gaze and stated there was no mistake, that her husband had been very precise, that the clause was handwritten, signed, witnessed, written while he was of sound mind, and therefore could not be disputed, which made Clarissa shoot up from her chair and pace like a trapped animal, shouting that it was outrageous, that I didn't deserve it, jabbing a finger at me with eyes burning in rage, as she accused me of having already taken enough of his time, attention, and pity, and declared the house and estate were hers by right, while I sat perfectly still with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart pounding as I wanted to defend myself, but found my voice failing me, until it was Mr. Whittaker who held firm and told Clarissa to sit down in a tone so authoritative it silenced even her, forcing her to drop back into her chair reluctantly, fuming, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, before he gently said there was more, and turned his attention to me. his eyes softening as I saw not just the lawyer but the family friend who had known Matthew as a boy, telling me my son had left a letter and insisted it be read aloud in that very room. My breath catching at the words, "A letter from Matthew," as Mr. Whitaker reached into the folder and pulled out a single sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, as if handled many times, breaking the seal carefully and unfolding the pages as his voice grew steady and solemn while he read that. If I was hearing those words, it meant he was no longer there to hold my hand, hear my laugh, or argue with me over the little things we both knew didn't matter, that he knew I must be hurting and was sorry, but wanted me to know I was the best part of his life always. At which point my eyes blurred with tears and I pressed a trembling hand to my mouth as my son's voice came back to life, in ink, admitting he knew Clarissa and I had not seen eye to eye, that she had pushed me away and he regretted not doing more to bridge that gap, calling himself weak in that regard, but swearing he never stopped loving me. Never. While across the table Clarissa shifted uncomfortably, her face paling as though each word exposed her, as the letter continued that the Ridgewood mansion was more than a house, that it was our family's heart, that I had raised him there and sacrificed everything for him there, and that he wanted me to have it not as wealth or power but as a sanctuary, a place where I could feel him still walking the halls and remember I would always be his home, causing me to gasp quietly and clutch the edge of the table as the room seemed to vanish and all I could see was Matthew's smile, his eyes, the little boy who once built forts in that very mansion's living room, as his words urged me to fill it with laughter again. Invite people in. Make it alive, not let grief turn it into a tomb, declaring it belonged to me and no one else as his final wish. After which Mr. Whitaker folded the letter slowly, his own throat thick with emotion, and handed it to me with great care as I took it in shaking hands and pressed it to my chest, feeling for the first time since Matthew's passing not just grief but love, his love, as even from the grave he reached out and wrapped me in his arms, until Clarissa broke the silence with a bitter laugh that cracked under strain, as she claimed it was absurd, that he had been manipulated and hadn't meant it, though the look in her eyes betrayed her because she knew the truth and knew she had lost, while Mr. Whitaker leaned back and steepled his fingers, stating the clause was airtight and the mansion belonged to Ruth Ann, and that if she tried to contest it she would lose, causing Clarissa's shoulders to slump as fear flickered across her face for the first time instead of triumph, while I sat quietly, with the letter still in my hands, having come expecting humiliation and to leave empty, only to receive a gift far greater than property, proof that my son's love had never faltered even in his last days, and for Clarissa, her carefully built tower of arrogance was beginning to crumble. Though little did I know this was only the beginning of her downfall, as her face went from pale to crimson in seconds, her lips trembling and fists clenched until her knuckles whitened, unraveling before my eyes as she spat the words "the mansion," repeating it in disbelief and refusing to accept it, insisting it was supposed to be hers and that Matthew had promised, while Mr. Whitaker remained unshaken, closed the folder, folded his hands neatly on the desk, and said he understood this was difficult, but her husband's wishes were clear, and that the Ridgewood estate was now the property of Ruth Ann. It is legally binding. Clarissa shot out of her chair and began pacing like a wild animal trapped in too small a cage, her heels clacking sharply against the polished floor with every furious step as she snapped that this was ridiculous and that I didn't even know how to manage a house like that, calling me old and careful, until Mr. Whitaker warned her sharply to be careful, cutting her off mid-sentence and making her stop with her chest heaving as she turned toward me, her eyes narrowing into slits while she accused me of thinking I'd won, of sitting there like some saint clutching that letter, insisting I didn't deserve it and never had, and I didn't respond because I couldn't, my son's letter still pressed against my chest with the words ringing in my ears, "You will always be my home," and that silence only fueled her rage as she slammed her hand against the desk hard enough to rattle the pens and vowed to contest it, to drag it through the courts if she had to, declaring the mansion was hers, while Mr. Whitaker leaned forward with a calm but ironclad voice and told her she was welcome to try, Mrs. Matthews. But her husband had been thorough and ensured every word would withstand challenge, and that she would waste time, money, and whatever reputation she still had left, which made Clarissa's mouth open and then shut as she realized it was true, and the fight drained from her just for a moment. And in that pause I saw it clearly, the greed, the the panic, the realization that everything she had schemed for had slipped through her fingers, and it was a strange feeling sitting there across from her, because part of me pitied this woman who had married my son not for love but for what she thought she could gain, while a larger part of me felt justice, knowing Matthew had seen through her, even if it took him time, and had protected his mother in the end. As Clarissa sank back into her chair and glared at me with venom, hissing that I should enjoy it while I could because the neighbors would talk and say I manipulated and guilted him into this, but her words slid off me like rain on stone because for the first time in years I felt unshakable and didn't need the town's approval or her validation, since I had Matthew's love written, sealed, and undeniable. And when Mr. Whitaker stood to signal the end of the meeting, and said that concluded the reading of the will, told Clarissa she could leave, and asked me to sign papers to formalize the transfer of ownership, she stormed out and slammed the door so hard the picture frames rattled and her perfume lingered like smoke after a fire. Yet the room felt lighter without her, as I signed the documents with trembling hands and thought of Ridgewood Hill, the red brick walls, ivy crawling up the sides, the wide wraparound porch where Matthew had played as a boy, a place I had believed lost to Clarissa's shadow, but was now mine again, not as wealth or a trophy, but as a living memory and sanctuary of what my son and I shared. And when the last paper was signed, Mr. Whitaker placed a firm hand over mine, and softly told me my son loved me very much, and that this house and decision were his way of showing it, making tears well in my eyes that were no longer from humiliation but healing. And as I walked out of that office, the world looked different, the skies brighter and the air lighter, because Clarissa had left in fury while I left with peace, though I knew the story wasn't finished and people like her don't fade quietly. And as I looked down at the mansion keys in my hand, I realized the gift carried responsibility, because the house was a piece of my son's soul. And later, as the keys felt heavy not from weight but meaning, and I drove past Ridgewood Hill, watching ivy creep up the bricks and seasons paint its walls while remembering how it had been, Clarissa's house where I was barely tolerated, the gates swung open and I drove the winding path feeling nerves, anticipation, and fear as the front door creaked and dust hung in the air, my heels tapping on wooden floors while memories flooded me of Matthew as a boy with toy cars, as a teenager at the piano, as a man in the garden promising me not to worry. And as I walked room to room slowly and reverently, I saw Clarissa's cold, sterile touch everywhere, yet beneath it felt the warmth of what the home once was, and almost heard my son's laughter echoing through the walls. In the study, I found something I didn't expect, a desk drawer that stuck when I tried to pull it open, and after some effort it finally slid out, revealing a bundle of envelopes tied with twine that made my heart stop as I untied them with trembling hands and realized they were letters from Matthew addressed to me. The first beginning, simply, "For when you need to remember," and I read it right there at the desk with tears streaming down my face, as his gentle words carried the same warmth he had shown as a child. Writing about his memories of us, the nights we stayed up late talking, the meals we shared, the times I comforted him when the world felt too heavy. And in another letter he wrote, "I know Clarissa has tried to push you away. I regret letting it happen. Please believe me, Mom. I never stopped loving you. This house will always be yours in my heart." And each letter felt like a lifeline pulling me back from the abyss of grief, as if he had prepared for this moment and left breadcrumbs of his love for me to follow. So I spent hours in that study reading until my eyes burned, and by the time I finally stood, dusk had settled outside. I lit the fireplace and sat in the armchair clutching the letters close, feeling Matthew with me for the first time in months, not gone but present in a different way. Though peace was something Clarissa couldn't allow, because 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from her attorney announcing she was contesting the will after all, claiming undue influence, and accusing me of manipulating Matthew into giving me the mansion, the vile accusations painting me as a bitter old woman, scheming against her son's marriage. And for a moment I feared not for the house, but for Matthew's memory. The thought of his love being dragged through court and twisted into something ugly breaking my heart, until Mr. Whitaker reassured me that she didn't have a case, that the will was ironclad and the courts would see that. And he was right, because the challenge fell apart almost immediately, the judge dismissing it with barely a glance, as Clarissa left the courthouse red-faced and trembling with fury, which became the final nail, as the town that had whispered uncertainly after the funeral now saw her for what she truly was: greedy, cold, manipulative. And for once, I wasn't the one standing outside the church doors in shame. She was, And not long after that, I stood on the mansion's balcony watching the sunset stretch golden across the gardens and thought of Matthew running through those gardens as a boy and choosing this place to carry his family forward, remembering his words, "Don't let grief turn it into a tomb. Fill it with laughter again." And so I decided to invite neighbors for tea, open the garden gates for children to play, host small gatherings until slowly the mansion came alive again. No longer Clarissa's cold showpiece, but Matthew's home and mine. While Clarissa faded from sight with her power gone and influence stripped away until people stopped speaking of her altogether, as though she were a shadow best forgotten. While the mansion stood proud on Ridgewood Hill, not as a monument to wealth, but as proof of a son's love for his mother. And within its walls I finally began to heal, as the seasons changed, and so did I. The mansion transforming from a battlefield into a haven filled with children's laughter, the aroma of tea, and the warm crackle of winter fires, breathing life back into Ridgewood Hill, and helping me understand that Matthew had wanted me to have not just walls and windows or bricks and timber, but a home where I would remember I was loved, cherished, and never alone. And sometimes late at night I would sit by the study window, with his letters spread across my lap, their words never growing old and sounding like a conversation that never ended, his voice echoing in my heart as I learned that, while grief never fully leaves you, love softens its edges. And Clarissa's story faded quickly as her battles crumbled beneath the truth, and the community that once whispered against me began to see clearly, no longer pitying me but respecting me, some even apologizing quietly for not standing with me from the start, while Clarissa drifted away from town life, selling what little she had left, and chasing another chance elsewhere. And I found that I didn't hate her but pitied her, because wealth without love and power without kindness are nothing but dust slipping through your hands. And in forgiving her for my own sake, I refused to let her cruelty poison the gift Matthew left behind, realizing the lesson in all of this, that possessions can be lost, stolen, or given away, but true love leaves traces no one can erase. Because my son left me his mansion, yes, but more importantly, he left me his heart written in ink, sealed in words that time cannot fade. To those of you listening right now, perhaps sipping tea in your own quiet living room, or lying awake in the late hours of the night, let me tell you this: never doubt your worth in the eyes of those who truly love you, because greed may shout the loudest, but love endures in silence. And though I was locked out of my son's funeral, shamed before the world, and believed I had lost everything, the truth is, I had only begun to see how deep the bond between a mother and child can truly run. For Clarissa tried to erase me, but Matthew made certain I would never be forgotten. And now when I walk the halls of Ridgewood, I do not feel alone at all. I feel him. I see him in the way the sunlight falls across the banister, in the echo of laughter in the parlor, in the creak of the old floorboards, and in every corner I hear his voice reminding me, "You will always be my home." And to you, dear listener, I say, hold your family close, speak your love while you can, and if you have been wronged as I was, remember this justice has a way of finding its path, even when all seems lost. And I hope my story has touched you today. And before we part, I would love to know where you are watching from, and what stories of family, of love, of heartbreak and healing you carry in your heart. So share them with me, because in the end, it is through sharing our stories that we keep love alive. And thank you for sitting with me, for letting me open my heart to you. And may you find peace, may you find joy, and may you never forget that true family is not defined by who locks you out, but by who keeps you alive in their heart forever.